Hello and welcome to episode 8 of Stay on Target, GamesRadar Plus's weekly guide to that galaxy far, far away. With me today are Chris Thurston of PC Gamer Magazine, Jordan Farley of SFX Magazine. I'm Richard Edwards, the editor of SFX Magazine. Now, it is now less than 6 months until Star Wars returns in The Force Awakens, which is very big news. Can't wait. Can those 6 months go fast enough? But we thought this was a good opportunity to actually ask, is Star Wars still as big deal as everybody seems to think? Since the first movies came out, we've had many other big franchises. Lord of the Rings, we've had Harry Potter, Marvel Cinematic Universe. Is Star Wars still the biggest kid on the block? Now, Star Wars, it's a 40-year-old franchise pretty much. Why has it endured so well?
Well, it's quite a big question.
Just get into it.
Well, I mean, the obvious first answer to address is the fact that the original films are freaking amazing.
Yeah.
There's a reason why people are still watching them and adoring them today, because they're 2.5 or 3 of the best films ever made. Which, you know, and they captured the imagination in a way that few films do as well, because of the fact that they built this incredible universe which set a huge precedent for sci-fi that followed, and kind of twisted science fiction on its head in the way that it was before, because it was all, before that it was all quite clean, and it was all quite retro, and it was all, it had that kind of retro futuristic feel, but Star Wars had that down and dirty and almost practical feel to it. Like, it felt like a believable future universe.
Except it is a long time ago.
Yeah, a long time ago.
Well, I guess that's also one of the great things that Star Wars did, as well as being this sort of science fiction thing with spaceships and stuff. It's got this mysticism. It kind of almost taps into a sort of Middle-earthy sort of fantasy vibe at the same time.
Yeah, and there's huge amounts of, like, you know, various world religions bolted together to kind of construct, like, the Force and the kind of things people say about it. I think that's right, that because it was an inhabitable universe, it kind of, and it wouldn't necessarily be the first, you know, story that people wanted to kind of climb inside and occupy, but it was certainly one of the first 2 big mainstream pop culture universes to achieve that. Like, science fiction, the other thing about science fiction prior to Star Wars is that it tended to be set in the future of Earth and the future of humanity. That's, you know, that's Star Trek. That's even, you know, Buck Rogers, or, you know, there's like Flash. You know, there's a kind of there is a sense that this is our future, and therefore it's a kind of, maybe in some ways a harder thing to kind of flesh out fully, is this alternate, you know, universe or alternate reality. You know, you can see the exact same process happen with Harry Potter, which, you know, is I guess as close to, I think probably, I would say, as close as any other franchise has got to mimicking what Star Wars did, and for much the same reason actually that it took, you know, Harry Potter took children's book fantasy, you know, what would have been Chronicles of Narnia, or in some senses Lord of the Rings, although in a slightly different way. You know, there's tons of examples of, you know, school-age adventure with a bit of magical monster to it, but made it into a world again. You know, again, a world really coherent rules, and world that, you know, young people could imagine living in, and that's probably why it was so compelling. Is why you can sell tickets to go and walk down a street that's a bit like a street is from a book, because of that, for that exact reason. For the same reason I would go to a Mos Eisley Cantina themed bar if one existed.
And I mean, George Lucas also deserves a huge amount of credit, despite all the stick that he gets for the prequels, for kind of allowing people to play in his sandbox, like allowing the creation of the expanded universe, and allowing people to, you know, write all these stories and tell all these tales in his universe. Like, you know, letting Alan Dean Foster write Splinters of the Mind's Eye, the first kind of novelization of the Star Wars universe, and then it all kind of snowballing from there. The fact that people were continuing to tell stories in this universe and telling their own kind of parallel stories while the movies weren't necessarily going on the big screen was a big part of the reason why it's kind of endured. And
well, I think that's one of the interesting things about Star Wars. Basically, you had no movies between 1983 and 1999. Maybe you had some TV stuff and droids and Ewoks, but it kind of just kept itself going, didn't it? And then by the time the movies came back, the audience had grown up, their kids were coming into it, and it's kind of just stayed there. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, unlike the Harry Potter series, it's still kind of going. I mean, you know, J.K. Rowling's writing new stuff,
and there's
essentially,
Newt
Scamander and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, just the fact that there was so much stuff that happened in between Return of the Jedi and Episode 1. It just never even came close to like being off the cultural radar. It was always there. It was always in your eye, in the corner there.
And I guess all the iconography sort of got in there, like the sound, even the sounds are evocative, and the weapons and things, which I guess very few things have managed since.
Yeah, and the fact it was one of the first big, like, mega blockbusters as well, like it kind of brought in a kind of cultural change in Hollywood as well. Like, it changed the structure of the film industry. Just the fact that the summer massive blockbuster release schedule, and the fact that it would just be released again like year after year, and George Lucas was already kind of tinkering with it like the year after it was released, because originally it wasn't released as A New Hope. It came out like a year later as Episode 4 A New Hope, so he was always kind of playing with it as well and re-releasing it in cinemas even at that early stage.
And it took a long time to happen, but it's kind of set the blueprint for modern Hollywood. I mean, I'm not just talking about the fact that you make big sort of special effects movies, because that's been happening for a long, long time, but this idea of a shared universe with lots of things tapping in together, which is now seemingly what everybody wants to do. I mean, the biggest example, I guess, is the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which has recently become the most lucrative franchise in cinema history now. How do you think Star Wars is going to compete now that the whole world is into superheroes, and there's so much stuff like that going on? Is Star Wars still in a position to be a big player?
No question. I think, they have a slightly different approach to Marvel in the fact that, I mean, all Marvel's movies are part of one kind of continuing continuity which constantly moves forward, whereas the Star Wars films are going to kind of move about a bit, and they're going to be in different timelines. Like, the first anthology film is set long before Episode 7 is, so you're constantly jumping around a little bit, which is, could potentially be a bit confusing to people. Like, I always wonder in the Marvel films how much people actually like understand what's going on in the chronology. Do they watch everyone? Do they know did they know what all the post-credits things actually refer to and things like that? And is that going to be even more complicated for people with the Star Wars films if it's going to be jumping 50 years into the past a year after? But it's Star Wars. I think anyone's gonna, if they tell their stories properly and they set them up properly, I think people are still going to be just as enthralled by them.
I think Star Wars has an easier time actually than Marvel does, immediately kind of winning back an audience film to film, even with a huge gap, because the iconography of Star Wars is cinema iconography. The things that people remember are the sounds and shapes and actors and characters and spaceships and everything else. And as a consequence, you can, like, as happened with the trailers, you show people an X-wing again flying over some water and people lose it, because that is a purely cinematic image that reminds them of a different cinematic image. The Marvel films have actually had this uphill struggle to introduce comic book images to an audience that doesn't necessarily receive them normally. Like, I remember seeing Thor for the first time, and the thing that really struck me in Thor, which is a film I liked, was the shot right at the end where there's this sort of shot up at the God of Thunder up in the clouds and the hammer spinning above his head, and the image is 100% a panel from a comic book, and it's a powerful image if you're a comics nerd, but it doesn't really necessarily for a film audience. It doesn't have any of the same cachet, and Marvel had to work and work and work to build up to the point where the films have their own internal set of cool images and things that they can play with, rather than simply playing, as with the post-credits things, doing teases that you have to go and talk to your mate who reads the comics to understand. And so for that reason, because Star Wars is, despite having had all this expanded universe stuff, at its core a cinematic achievement, it's much easier, I think, for it to return and go, hey, this is back, this really well, and it's that again. Yeah.
I think it was also quite smart of Disney to relegate the expanded universe to Legends as well, because it was unwieldy, to say the least. Like, there was, I love Star Wars and I haven't consumed half of the expanded universe, nowhere near that. So I would have had no idea if they'd have just said, yep, this is all still canon, but I'd have had no idea what was going on. But the fact that they've kind of started again and they've made it a bit more manageable now also means there's a nice jumping on point for people to start reading the comics, start watching Rebels, start watching the Clone Wars, things like this, start playing the games that are all canon now.
Now, what would you think the appetite is out there for space opera now? When the prequels came out, Star Trek was still on telly, Battlestar Galactica happened during the prequels, whereas now there's not that much on TV. There's a bit coming back. We had Guardians of the Galaxy last year. I mean, do we think people are still up for outer space? Or does Star Wars exist outside that?
I think Star Wars exists outside that to a substantial degree. Like, because, I mean, honestly, we described it as a sci-fi movie earlier. The original trilogy isn't a sci-fi movie, nor is it really a war movie, nor is it, one thing I was going to say, actually, one of the reasons I think for its success is that it's the genre movie. It came from an era of genre movies where you had, like Star Wars almost ended the notion of the B movie in some ways. Like you know, the notion of this like one-shot monster flick or this one-shot, you know, action movie or martial arts movie, because it brought in, you know, samurai movies with World War II dogfighting movies with you know sort of operatic hero's journey, you know, fantasy adventure films, and then put all of that in space. And those things combined don't make sci-fi; they make Star Wars. And that's you know, and for that reason, the fact that it's spaceships is only a part of why the whole thing is what it is. So for that reason, I think it probably exists independently of any kind of current trend with whether people like spaceships. That said, the vast and completely unprecedented success of Guardians of the Galaxy suggests that people do very much like spaceships and talking animals.
And Marvel.
And Marvel.
Yeah.
Therefore...
And Chris Pratt.
Yeah. So all these things coming together.
God, that's probably it, isn't it? They saw Guardians of the Galaxy and went, we're going to make that again.
Yeah.
Because it's such a different beast to Star Trek, isn't it? Which is, you know, celebrates its 50th anniversary last year. But that's even though the J.J. Abrams movies have been successful, they're kind of on a sort of, in terms of sort of cultural cachet, they're almost on a level below in terms of the box office and things.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think anything's as big as Star Wars, to be honest. Even like, you know, Harry Potter and James Bond, all these films that have gone on forever, like they just, I don't know, they just feel like just a small step down from Star Wars to me.
Well, I guess it's less, their films are less of an event just because of quantity, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. It's like Grand Theft Auto in games, like, you know, that's released every 5 years and it becomes this big milestone event in gaming calendars. Whereas Star Wars, you know, it does feel like that as well, which, I mean, to a certain extent, the fact that they're going to be releasing a film every year just kind of makes me a little bit sad.
Well, that's the interesting thing, is it? Because you're going to have, before 2020, well, the next 5 years, you're going to have had nearly as many Star Wars movies made as there have been in the entirety of history.
Yeah.
You know, and does
hopefully
that
twice as many good ones.
Well, that is the remarkable thing about Star Wars, that, you know, 6 live-action movies, of which you'd probably say, well, 2.5 are good, yet it is the most loved thing out there.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's the other thing, is it's the only one that's really been tested by a low patch. Like, you know, Marvel, the MCU hasn't really had its Duff movie yet in a massive way. Like, there are movies people like less, like Iron Man 2.
Yeah.
But there's nothing, I mean, you know, I'd rather watch Iron Man 2 over the Phantom Menace of the Attack of the Clones any day. Like, really, I mean, Iron Man 2's got its moments everyone likes. I've
got a real soft spot for the Phantom Menace, but we can talk about that another time.
Talk about that. But you know what I mean? It certainly hasn't gone through this sort of like years-long slump where everything is appalling.
Yeah.
Like, because who knows if it would survive that? But Star Wars did, which is extraordinary.
Well, I think that just about is scientific proof that Star Wars will be huge. Who knew? We'll be back next week for more Star Wars action, but in the meantime, may the Force be with you.